We have tonight Cécile Debray, who's the director of the Picasso Museum in Paris, and also a great scholar of Balthus, and Nicholas Cullinan, who's the director of the National Portrait Gallery. We're all very eagerly anticipating in a few days the reopening, so lots to see. And our very own Yvan Gare, who worked very much about this exhibition in the catalogue.
So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you both for coming. I know we've been looking forward to having you here for a while now, and it's interesting, sometimes we do these talks when the exhibition opens, and I must admit that when we do them further into the exhibition, we usually have a better sense of what we talk about and how we feel with the exhibition around us, and it seems to be a great opportunity to actually talk about this show almost 2 months into its running. I wanted to start with an anecdote, in a way maybe picking up from the last time Balthus was here in London, and that was in an exhibition that took place in 1968. So 55 years ago was the last exhibition of Balthus in London, and it took place at the Tate Galleries. At the time, John Russell, who was the curator of the exhibition, has a very famous anecdote that he then put down in the exhibition catalogue as well, where he wrote a very nice and extensive biographical essay about Balthus that was meant to accompany the exhibition, and he sent it to Switzerland to Balthus to review, and got back this very same documents into his office, crossed out largely with a pen, and with a threat by Balthus that he might withdraw his support to the exhibition. So Russell thought, what would you like us to write on your biographical note? And Balthus wrote very clearly and very specifically a reply, and he said, please write the following. Balthus is an artist of whom nothing is known. Now, let us look at his paintings. And that was a brilliant start for us when we started looking at the last point Balthus was here, because there's a great breadth to this saying that nothing is known. And indeed, after 50 years of not showing an artist in a certain place, there is a lack or an absence of knowledge. But also with Balthus, there's always seems to be that tension, that play between telling us a lot about himself, but often by trying very hard not to tell us anything. We have this great opportunity to speak to two curators and scholars who have had intimate attempts at trying or making Balthus exhibitions, because Nick, at the time you were at Tate, you've had the privilege of being offered the idea and trying to promote an exhibition like this that did not materialize. And Cécile, you've curated the exhibition that started in Rome, the retrospective of 2015, probably one of the largest ever been, and continued then also to Vienna. And I'd like to start by asking both of you, where do you think, I think one of the biggest problems we have is exactly where would one position Balthus in art historical terms? It's the period he starts working, obviously, the late 1920s, early 1930s is very characterized by isms and groups, and how does one put or places Balthus within this narrative? So Cécile, maybe you'd like to start?
Yeah. Thank you for this invitation, Daniela, and all the team. Just to say in this beautiful room, I like very much the orange, the painting is beautiful, and I'm very moved by to see again all these paintings. The place of Balthus is very singular, but we can remind the way he was with Giacometti or with Derain. He was in a small group during the 30s, which was near to the surrealism, but not in the surrealism, but perhaps on the side of Bataille, and they wanted to promote the figuration with classical roots, but also in a modern way. That means they wanted to use the figuration to express to express a sort of how to say in English, the political meaning of the reality, and how to point out the problems, the contemporary problems of the society through a sort of figuration, and it's not very common figuration. We can say a sort of cruelty or very dry way to describe the reality. I don't know. I'm not very clear, but it's.
Would you agree to that, Nick? I mean,
yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a difficult body of work in multiple ways, but a fascinating body of work. And I mean, in terms of the anecdotes, his telegram to John Russell is very compelling, but also, of course, we have to treat it with great caution. And I think obviously Balthus did have a bit of perhaps a negative response to biography. I mean, beyond even potentially refuting biography, he also, I think, planted many red herrings for his biographers and claimed all kinds of things, which, Cécile, you know much more about his life and his status than were perhaps true. And to unpick those has been quite difficult. But just to move away from biography in terms of situating him, I mean, I suppose in a way he was an artist who always was trying to be apart in some way from perhaps what other artists were doing, certainly from the kind of main artistic trends and isms that you mentioned when he was working over a more than 40-year career. And as you say, you can situate, he's adjacent to surrealism in some ways, which I think we can talk more about this evening, in terms of the uncanny and something often quite unsettling, which was very much, part of the rhetoric around surrealism. You can compare him to Neue Sachlichkeit, which, overlapped with his early career, and yet he's also different from all of those movements. And of course, the other thing to remember is he was very much looking back at other models, whether it was the very grand French tradition of, for example, Courbet, but even further back, think about Poussin, many references to Poussin. I could go on. And of course, looking back at Renaissance, Italian Renaissance examples, including, of course, Piero della Francesca that he referenced and talked about a great deal. So it's quite tricky. In a funny way, I'm reminded of Cy Twombly, who's an artist I also worked on. And actually, when I began trying to do a Balthus show at Tate, it was just having done the Twombly show in 2008. And they reminded me of each other a lot because Cy had an adverse reaction to biography, and of course also sort of moved away from a kind of artistic center and the then dominant discussions and trends around abstract expressionism to instead focus on, antiquity, this kind of very traditional background. So yeah, it's difficult. He doesn't fit in any one category, but I think you can also very much situate him, especially in an intellectual milieu. And for example, the 1968 catalogue that you referenced, that John Russell curated, you have an essay by Artaud, you have an essay by Camus. This is not an artist that was somehow apart from, as you mentioned, Cécile, intellectual and artistic discussions of his time.
Yeah. It's interesting because I should probably point out that one of the earliest painting we have in this exhibition is the painting that's here on our left, which is a portrait of Madame Pierre Loeb, the wife of Pierre Loeb, the first gallerist to give Balthus an exhibition in Paris. And this exhibition is very much characterized by the fact that it's hard to pin down. And some of the portraits are extremely, extremely realistic, so to speak, and others are extremely provocative, like the guitar lesson and the street, and some of his most provocative work was shown in that exhibition. In fact, the guitar lesson was behind a curtain, and only those who knew could go back and see that painting. While paintings like this one, exactly, you say Neue Sachlichkeit, and I'm thinking another reference which is relevant here is probably the Nabis and people like Pierre Bonnard, who ended up being some of the people who kind of entered or helped Balthus enter the scene. So it's interesting. And that brings us to the question that Balthus always kind of, I think his biggest antagonism to the term surrealism had to do with the fact that he spoke about painting from observation. That he said he didn't make up fantasies, which obviously he did, but in a very different ways. But I wonder in that respect, Cécile, you mentioned exactly his attraction to bataille, Would you say something maybe about the distinction between the kind of bataille, breton, what does that mean, and what does that mean to Balthus?
Yes, for me, Balthus is completely representative of the 30s. It's really born artistically between the two wars, and if we recall the 30s, it was a period of great intensity and a great crisis, political crisis, social crisis, and the question of surrealism was a movement that tried to rehabilitate the figuration, but to transform reality, just to try to catch what is behind reality, the dream, or something like phantasmagory. But inside this movement, you had a sort of conflict between Breton and bataille, and it's very simple simplification as I present it, but bataille considers was more on the side of psychanalysis, or how the reality is moved by sexuality or the unconsciousness. And you had also another character who played an important role, was Antonin Artaud. Antonin Artaud was very close to Bataille, to this group, and he was very a close friend to Balthus, and he considered that the reality is cruelty, and is difficult, and the art should play a role to deal with this difficulty. And for example, the theater, as we know since the antiquity, the theater could allow a catharsis. So when you represent the reality with all a sort of exaggeration of the evil, of the cruelty and sexuality, in order to leave the phantasm, but not to do it in reality. It's, I don't know, it's a little bit, and so I think it's very important today to recall this intellectual background, because Balthus wrote a very important letter to his wife, or his beloved at this time, about these paintings that he exhibited at Galerie Pierre, these erotic paintings. And he explained that if you want that people see something of your painting, you have to paint something very, very strong, and only erotic painting could be seen. So it was nearly a political statement when he did this erotical paintings. And I just want to add that with Balthus, the difficulty is that there is a huge difference between the Balthus of the 30s and the Balthus as an old man. You know, it's when, for example, I read something about the way he illustrated the Wuthering Heights by Bronte, and he chose to illustrate only the first part. So when Heathcliff was humiliated and children and so on. But the second part, he didn't want to illustrate, and the author that who stressed it said because he wanted to live it. So the second part is what he did. You know, there is something very biographical in this, or identification with this character. So that means just for me there is nearly two Balthus.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, can I just pick up on that? And I completely agree. I mean, one of the ways that he's sort of out of time is also in a way the cycle and the progression of his own career, because as you say, there's very different chapters. There's chapters depending on also where he lived and what type of studio he had and what he was drawing inspiration from. But what's also interesting, and you see so beautifully on the wall, sorry, everyone's going to have to crane their neck and look at the wall across from us, but these three versions of a motif that he painted numerous times. There's other examples beyond these three that you've gathered here, but this illustrates the point well. This motif of three sisters that he almost obsessively went back and painted and painted and painted again. And these span more than 20 years, I believe. There's one almost per decade, in fact, almost more so. And so for me too, there's this, and I completely agree that the 30s is a very particular chapter, and in a way, perhaps more savage and almost more violent. And then you could say that as his work progresses and he moves to the countryside, he moves to Rome, and then he moves to Switzerland, it becomes more pastoral, you see more landscapes, it becomes, in a way, more classical. But the same motifs are always there. And there's this tension, in a way, between development and also repetition and almost working within series.
Yeah, but when you look at these three paintings, the first one is not the Three Sisters series, is Le Salon. Yeah. And you see how hard is this representation. And you have this little girl at the foreground. Yeah. She's like Cathy in the scene of with Heathcliff, and it's pretty hard and pretty uncomfortable, you know, with it's a slight eroticism with children. And then when you look at these two, so this on the right side is older, and this is still children, and it's still a bit. You see the evolution, and this one was in the center. It was painted at Rome when he wanted to do fresco, and it's like the motif is disappearing. It's
in
mostly
this very accreted
sort of
surface.
Yes. It's like.
It's fascinating looking at this one. I think earlier Brandon and I were looking at this painting, and I think there's suddenly seeing that it has such a thick layer of paint applied to it, but at the same time it seems like the actual coloring comes almost at the surface. Yeah. So there's if there's a construction underneath it and so on. And that actually was one of the things we discovered working on this exhibition was the underlayer and his preoccupation with underlayers. And you see it very clearly in the salon in the background there, where you see the orange underlayer, which is very unexpected to find this color. But then once we saw this, it started popping up everywhere, including in this early work here of Madame Pierre Loeb, where such a strong orange comes from the back. But that's such an unusual thing to see. Yeah,
I think that's what you explore so beautifully and powerfully in the exhibition, the idea of surface on two levels, that the idea of cautioning against reading them at surface value, but also his ever-shifting relationship to surface. And as you say, you know, beginning earlier on where it's much more rooted in drawing, and of course the gallery next to us show what an extraordinary draftsman he was through his career, and then moving through into the later work that, as Cécile was saying, you know, draw inspiration from fresco techniques, have this very heavy, almost accreted surface where the disegno, the drawing, is almost dissolved in them. But yeah, I think surface is one of the main shifts in his in the appearance of the works.
René Char called, you know that René Char, you know this expression from, so the poet René Char called for describing the painting by Balthus. Say it's a rouge-gorge infus. I don't know if you you can translate it. You know, it's a bird with this red, un fût, it's...
Infused.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ah, yeah.
It's, you could have called your exhibition like this. Yeah. Yeah. But just... we feel, because you were asking about the periods of Balthus,
Yes, very much
we
so.
feel with these three paintings how Balthus was, when he get more famous and more wealthy, he was calmer, you know, like a reconciliation with him. So it's, I think you feel it with these paintings.
So there's something that people often attribute to Balthus, and that's kind of and it's interesting to see, because one of the things, you know, when we had a conversation about this today already, the attempt to find an angle when one does an exhibition, particularly of an artist of this caliber, that's, you know, the pile of catalogs we have in the office is very intimidating. And often, I think one of the things, though, that seems to have been a big preoccupation around Balthus was his approach to time, not only in the sense of, I mean, I suppose, as you already mentioned, the ability Balthus had to at once be indebted to Italian Renaissance, French Grand painting, and then at the same time to try and be very of his time. But there is a sense of time within the paintings, which is very unusual. One of the things I think are most remarkable is how there is never an appearance of any technology, even though he was painting throughout the 20th century. A telephone, a car, any kind of technological device would always be absent. But there is certainly a sense of periodization, and these three sofas across from us are clearly a preoccupation with very particular types of design. And I'm even curious whether the family Col, which he was painting, had really changed its sofa over 10 years from this to that. Is there anything you could tell us a bit more about, for example, his consistency in looking at the same models over long periods of time, repeating the same subject, and in general his sensation of time in his work?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to say is that it's often time mediated by memory. I think that's one of the estrangements of time that you see in his work, that even if, and obviously he painted from life, but you see in these works that although they were painted from numerous sittings, he's also playing in a way with memory. And if I'm right, I believe the last work, which was painted in Rome, wasn't from life. It was painted on his memories of those sittings. And in a way, there's this strange act where he ages the sitters as if they've moved with him, even though it's a motif from early in his career.
Because I think it's exactly the beautiful thing. If you look at the two, I think her name is Sylvie, the sister on the left, seems to have hardly changed over the period of almost a decade, while the sister on the right seems to have changed from a very little girl to a very...
But then the other thing to say is this works the other way as well. And in some of his portraits of, you know, grown adults and women, for example, this one, they're rendered as these almost sort of doll-like, childlike mannequins. So he's often manipulating, I would say, time and age and the human form. I mean, the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is some of the childhood references and the 19th century references, but maybe we'll move on to that.
No, it's true. It's a very particular world, the Balthus world. And Pierre Klossowski, his brother, explained very well how the locus, the place that he dreamed of and that he has also acquired, because he bought a sort of castle, and he was so at the Villa Medici, like a lord in his own palace, but it was a republic palace. But and so Pierre Klossowski did a sort of psychanalytic explanation that Balthus was very stuck on his childhood, and he had a sort of very not structuralist, but he was obsessed by the architectonic structure, and so like Piero della Francesca, but it was also a way for him to look at the place and at the space. And so his painting is like a theater or a tableau vivant. This explanation, tableau vivant, is very accurate for Balthus, because he puts the setting and he play with the models like dolls.
And I mean, a great example of that is La Rue. Well, there's two versions, but the famous one in MoMA from the early 30s, 1929. Yeah. And you can still identify the particular street in Paris that he painted. If you go and stand where he painted, it's exactly the same. Yeah. But of course, it's populated with this very strange cast of characters, which, you know, draw. For example, the man carrying the plank is a reference to Piero della Francesca. Oh, really? Okay. But it's, so I think there you have this tension between something very realistic and something completely drawn from the imaginary.
But it's really an imaginary projection, and he did the same with his own life, because he wanted to be an aristocrat, and so he forced people to address to him like he would have been an aristocrat. And he was always playing with people with a sort of perversity, but it's I think in his painting it's the same. He played with the models, with the settings, and this
there's
is
often a conflation of different historical references. So even in La Rue, for example, there's references to, this is what I want to talk about in terms of the 19th century, all of these sort of childlike references to illustrations by Tenniel for Alice in Wonderland, also the illustrations for Shock-Headed Peter, you know, the German cautionary tales that I read and probably damaged me as a child. And so he often makes these 19th century sort of from the world of childhood references into other scenes.
It's interesting, and it's interesting you mentioned these constructions, the repetition. I think there's something to be said about Balthus. First of all, a painter that painted a limited number of paintings, about 300 paintings altogether, but painted so few subjects, repeating subjects, but also repeating scenes. So, for example, the painting we have there, which is from 1948, has been painted 3 times, every time with a very mild or simple change. Mm-hmm. So this one is called Le Poisson Rouge, the golden fish, but it is a singular golden fish, because there's another painting that is identical next to it, but has a woman entering the scene and 2 fish and a shorter candle held by the boy, and it's called the red fish in plural form, obviously. But these kinds of repeating these constructions, looking at them again and again.
But can I ask, and Cécile, you'll know more about this, but I wanted to ask about the repetition within the oeuvre, because in a way we're signaling it's something quite pure, that he had this fascination and he kept going back. But often when an artist, especially when a painter, repeats his earlier work, I'm thinking of De Chirico or maybe even Dali, Matisse, it can often be also for less pure reasons, like commercial reasons, that it's a popular subject and people want to buy it, so they make multiple versions. Did you get to the bottom of this?
Obsession. Yeah.
Okay, so it's the former rather than the latter.
Well, I think the universe of Balthus is very, not narrow, but
closed.
Yeah, it's very closed.
Yeah.
So, and he painted very slowly. And he painted the models were mostly people of his surroundings. And so, I don't know, the commercial, he was not so good. He wasn't a good commercial, because Pierre Matisse, his dealer wanted him to paint and to project, and because he was pretty famous at this time, and he played with he preferred, perhaps, I don't know, it's an interpretation, but perhaps he preferred to make his dealer mad than to do it. He was very, very not proud, fier. It's proud also. It's the same. It's the same term. Yes, he was very, very proud, but in a strange way. So it was difficult.
I'm just thinking, so we speak of this closed world, and I actually, we had a funny exchange today, because I kept, when people came to the show and I tried to emphasize this idea of the closed world, I always tell people about, for one reason or another, compared him to Morandi, as in, it's so nice to compare him to somebody who was painting pots. Yep. But there's so little interaction, nobody's looking back at you. When the models look at us, they're faded, when they look either as dreaming or to each other. Or in one case, I think the one communicative figure in this whole exhibition is the cat over there, which is the most human of them all. But then you came today
because
and you said...
the cat is Balthus.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
yes.
But then today, you brought up a much more interesting comparative, which I think also relates to a closed universe, but also to another artist, and that was Lucian Freud. And maybe you want to say a word or two about that comparison and why you think that is an interesting,
Yeah, I had a chance to do an exhibition on Lucian Freud and to meet him monthly in London, and I was pretty intriguing by the parallel, because Lucian Freud was also very sarcastic, a little bit perverse also, and he played with his models. He was not played, but he had a certain cruelty, but a cruelty in his style. I mean, in his figurative painting, and he was very elegant. Very with this sense of humor, very similar to Balthus, and very well educated. I mean, he read a lot, and it it was a sort of a cross, or because Balthus was fond of English literature. Really, he read a lot of books, and it was at the center of his inspiration. And Lucian Freud was fond of French literature. He read Balzac, and he was fascinated by the French literature. So it's funny, and of course Lucian Freud painted very slowly. I think there is also 300 paintings in total, and is also considered as a painter for painters. And so what struck me is that Lucian Freud today is very famous, and there is nearly no polemics around his work. And now it seems to be nearly impossible to exhibit Balthus in a public museum. So I think it was the beginning of our discussion.
I think it's such a compelling comparison, actually, when you think about it. And even the fact that they both began their careers very young, as children, essentially. And of course, Balthus knew Rilke because his mother was Rilke's lover, and Rilke really, as a 12-year-old boy, supported him and helped to oversee the publication of a book that Balthus did with drawings as a 12-year-old. If you think about Freud, actually at the National Portrait Gallery, because Freud left his archive of drawings and sketchbooks, including childhood letters, and we've just done a big research project on them, and they'll be in the opening display. There's a lot of similarities, and also the way that both artists' work is rooted in childhood, and they began becoming almost fully formed adults, artists as children, and then some of the motifs. But I completely agree that, with Freud, there are darker undertones which seem to have been now fully absorbed and contextualized and perhaps exonerated. And with Balthus, it's gone the other way, where if I think back to even my first encounters with his work, which were when I was a student, I was lucky enough to see the major retrospective at Palazzo Grassi, just as he died in 2000, 2001. And even at that point, he was a very mainstream respected, celebrated figure. And it's since his death 20 years ago that he's become this much more troubled and troubling figure. I think it's a very compelling comparison.
And both came from the Middle Europa culture, and it's very important. I think.
But there is a point to say. It's interesting that Balthus was controversial from the get-go, and the early version of the street we passed around here today has a beautiful story, because one of the first people to buy Balthus was James Thrall Sobey, who was a collector but also a curator at the MoMA, and he came to Paris and he saw this first exhibition. He bought two of the most important paintings. He bought the guitar lesson and he bought the street. He went back to Connecticut. The guitar lesson he had no doubt that he can't show in the house, so he put in storage. But the street he hung in his living room, and soon enough people stopped coming. And after a while, the people wouldn't come to his home. He actually wrote to Balthus and asked him if he would change the painting slightly. And I think it's the only case in art history I know of a major artist who says, yes, bring the painting to Paris and I'll change it. And it brings us back to what you said about composition, that he said, people think I'm out there to provoke. But for me, if the composition works, I don't mind changing what disturbs you now in terms of, then he moves.
I don't quite believe that, but
no, again, but precisely.
Yeah, pinch of salt.
But you know what? So okay, so if we're before, because I'd really like,
but it was another period. It was after the Second World War, and I think this question of violence and the representation of violence was very specific of the 30s. And I think we have to stress again this question of the context today. And after the Second World War, you know that the figuration was a question because how can we represent after this experience of the Shoah and so on. And with Giacometti, they were the two because Giacometti come back to the figuration after abstraction. So it was very interesting. That's why the figuration after the Second World War was more on the side of the existentialism with Sartre, with Camus. And so this is a big shift. It's today, all these nuances are difficult to understand, but at this time it was very important. And perhaps today, when we are, with this question of the cancel culture and the question of the sexuality and art and so on, I think it's worth to explain this context and more than explain to say that art could be a very important vector in our time where the violence is coming again, the war is coming again, and sometimes we make parallels with the 30s. So all this question about representation, the role of art, and for me it's really, really important, and that's
exactly for this, Nick. Can I ask? And I'm sorry to put you on that spot of responsible for British institutions for the last 50 years, but the absence of Balthus from any kind of museum collections in this country. Yes, exactly. Thank you. And you're on. We're recording. No, really, I'm very curious to see if you've had any experience to kind of see whether. I mean, is this absence purely by not being in the right place in the right time? Does it have any?
It's a good question, and I was thinking about it in the run-up to this conversation, and of course in the last 10 years there have been major exhibitions for Balthus, just not in London. So there was one at the Met in New York where I actually worked, which Sabina Rewald, my former colleague and a scholar of Balthus's work going back to the early 80s, curated. That was in 2013 or 14. Yeah, and I remember even then it was finely judged, and there was lots of nervousness and discussions around the title, for example, of the show. That then travelled to Cologne, to the Museum Ludwig, There was the wonderful show that Cécile did, which was in Rome and then travelled to Madrid, to the Thyssen. There was
to Vienna.
To Vienna, sorry. And then there was the show which I didn't see at the Biola in Basel, which was only 4 or 5 years ago. So I think there's two things to say. One is that up until 4 or 5 years ago, because that's the last case we have, which interestingly overlaps with sort of the B2 moment, it was possible to do an exhibition, albeit perhaps increasingly difficult. I think it also depends on where the exhibition is, and we talked about this a little bit before, and I think, for example, maybe in Paris still it's more possible to discuss certain things that in London people are more nervous, or maybe in New York even more nervous, so it depends on context. I mean, in terms of London, yeah, as you say, it's been since 1968, the last exhibition, which is remarkable for a painter of this stature and quality and influence. And I should say too that he's still influencing many, many artists who are looking at his work. I can think of one example, Lisa Bryce, who references his work, who has just opened an exhibition at Sadie Coles. I mean, I could give many examples. It's not as if his work is no longer being looked at or thought about. It's that institutionally there is this real nervousness, which I also can understand. And as you say, there's been moments where I've got close to doing a Balthus show. It's never quite happened for different reasons. But the honest answer is now, I imagine it would be much, much harder than even 5 years ago. I don't know if you have the same perspective from perhaps a different place, or someone who's done an exhibition and survived and thrived, but...
I don't know. Yes, perhaps it's difficult, but I think we should do it. I think it's a question of because I'm confronted with Picasso, with a sort of the same, not the same situation, but it comes, and I think it's important to explain the context. So if you organize an exhibition on Balthus, but if you do it rightly, that means historically you explain all the evolution, you give the context, and you try to do very honestly the text. That means not ideologically, but honestly. That means historically, and you explain the cultural situation and so on. I tried modestly, but I tried to do my exhibition like that. And very often, for example, when I did the show on Dada Africa in Paris at the Orangerie, everybody told me, "Oh, you are crazy. If you are looking at the African sources with Dadaism, it would be." And I say, I think it's a good subject, so I will do it, and we will do it very honestly, and we explain, and there were no polemics. So I trust. Perhaps I'm a little bit optimistic, but I trust in the knowledge and yeah.
And I should just add to that I hope that the current moment is temporary, and that perhaps hopefully he's not become beyond the pale. And if it's difficult right now to do an exhibition in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, perhaps it won't be. I would hope that would be the case. And often artists' reputations and where they sit within the kind of contours of contemporary culture does shift and change. So I see no difference why that couldn't be the same here. I mean, also, the last time I went to Paris, to the Pompidou Center, there's a room dedicated to Balthus and actually his brother, Pierre Klosowski, that you mentioned. So it's still very much possible to see him in institutions. I believe at the Met, his works are still on display, although there was a petition, I believe, in 2017-18, which I remember, to remove all his works from display. So perhaps it's temporary. I think we have to kind of...
I think that the danger is really to be the auto-censor.
Yeah. Censorship, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in our field. I think it's a great danger.
And also, we mustn't be too anachronistic. And, you know, we talked about this before, but as we alluded, his work has always been difficult. It's not just difficult in the last 5 years because our consciousness has changed. It's been difficult since his first solo exhibition where the guitar lesson had to be behind a curtain because it's obviously difficult. He knew it was going to be difficult. So all that's changed is maybe the institutions right now, there's perhaps a loss of nerve or confidence in, as you say, being able to explain these things. But we talked about this before, it's so important that institutions can be advocates for artists and can explain things that are difficult and require context. Otherwise, there's a big question there.
I mean, as you're speaking, I can't stop thinking about, you know, you earlier mentioned surrealism and the background of surrealism, and to think that, you know, surrealism has been extremely harsh in its messages, sexually, politically, etc. But it's funny how eventually the classical depiction of Balthus is precisely the place where this becomes a lot harder, when it shifts away from what appears already as a construction, as a fantasy, as a collage, as a whatever kind of method, but suddenly you come to these almost classical paintings, and suddenly the tension of these subjects become a lot higher, the stakes are higher.
Yes, because in surrealism, when you say, you know, with collage, and you say, attention, this is a dream. This is a fantasy. But with Balthus, it's much more subtle.
Yeah.
It's a representation, and representation, classical representation. And this is the unheimlich. You know? This is the question of l'inquiétante étrangeté. And it's much stronger.
Very much so. I want to ask you one more question about the transition to drawings, but before this I just want to say that if everybody has any questions, then after this question we will open up the floor a bit. I just want to look at this other side of Balthus, the drawing side, and I'm curious because it seems to me with Balthus that there is a kind of uncertainty, unlike some artists, as to at what point and to what degree did drawing serve as as an instrument for working, and at what point it became completely a work in its own right, and how do the same concerns are translated between these two fields. I wonder if either of you has any commentary to make on this field, because I find, I found that when we did this exhibition, we were struck by the fact that he would repeat subjects in drawing sometimes to the same quantity and degree that he would in painting, but with a huge degree of attention. For example, on that wall there's a drawing which can be seen of, it's called Katia sleeping, and she was the daughter of the keeper of the Villa Medici, and he drew her again and again to such precision, but almost to the exact same result every time. And it didn't feel exactly like a commercial,
I think for the Roman period, the drawings were alimentaire. It was really a commercial purpose because he needed money to restore the Villa Medicis, and so he did this. And it's it's really I did a text on this because he has been nominated by Malraux as director of the Académie de France à Rome, so that means a very institutional place. But he was a bad boy like Lucian Freud. He hated museums and lessons and so on. So, but at this time he was appointed as director. So, what he did, he made drawings as an academician, just to say, okay, let's play as academician. And so he did perfect drawings, academician, one of these, but he did a lot, and he sold it. And so I think you found it in Roma or in Italy, and because he sold everywhere these drawings to make money. And so it's just one explanation. No. But what I like is the way to play as academician, and he did this with a certain perversity. And but the drawing during all his career was, of course, very important. And he did he did drawings with mise au carré to enlarge it for a very large painting. So very academician way to do it, but this period of Rome is very, very specific.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The drawings are hauntingly beautiful, I think, throughout his career. And actually, maybe for an exhibition, maybe that's a good way in, because perhaps the drawings sometimes are less troubling than some of the paintings, although there can be an undertone
Depends who
too.
you ask.
Yeah, it depends.
We've had
Anyway.
comments exactly opposite. That's
True.
interesting.
Yeah, that's true. But they are very, very beautiful. I mean, the other thing that we should not forget is the role of photography, which I think is really interesting and was pretty much concealed in his lifetime. And I remember when I was beginning to think about doing a show, this was back in 2008, 2009, the photographs and the Polaroids that he took throughout his career as compositional models of the model posing, but really as works perhaps in and of their own right as well, which is quite interesting. They've been completely suppressed and they just come to light. And so, again, he was very crafty at sort of editing his own image and editing out the role of photography in his process in terms of painting and drawing. I think he wanted a much more classical image, as you alluded to.
But photography appeared during Rome, not before.
Yeah.
And so it was in the same process for him. And then the Polaroid, yes, it's really interesting point how at the end, when he was too old to draw, when he was too old to paint, it was like a convulsion or a way to look as it would be the last time, and so he did it a lot. Yeah. Mm.
Is there any questions that anybody wants to raise? Yes, please.
I mean, I agree, and that's why I raised De Chirico, which is a much more sort of categorical, cut and dried example of someone that began being more transgressive or avant-garde and then begins to, in a form of pastiche, quote and even forge their earlier work. And I'm not saying that's the case for Balthus, but there is a similar, in a way, there's a similar trajectory. I completely see what you're saying, but I find the late work so weird sometimes, even just the surface, to go back to that word, these weird surfaces that are just odd and ugly, like willfully ugly. Like no, I mean, but he could always make a beautiful image, whether it was in painting or drawing, and he embraces ugliness for some reason, which I find fascinating. So I completely agree with what you're saying, but then there's perhaps something else you could say too, but yeah.
No, I agree, but I think it's the question of these drawings, especially these drawings, because I saw them and the painting are, let's say, less complicated or less sophisticated than but
There's certainly something, though, to say about the fact that there is a trajectory here that, in a way, I think Balthus set this. It's almost a fatalist ending to Balthus, because he, from a child, in Mitsu, for example, this book of drawings that you mentioned that he did when he was 12, which included the story of a child and their cat in this very glamorous mansion with help and keepers and so on, and it's kind of the story of him, but it's again a fantasy, clearly, because he didn't have that childhood. It seems like that fantasy has just been in the waiting to fulfill itself, and in there was exactly what made him so interesting, and so in a way, you could fantastic despite his depictions. Yeah.
Modern Heights comes into that.
Of course, yeah.
But then eventually he kind of enters that stage himself in a way, and he calls himself the Count de la Rola, even though he was not of an origins of but that kind of fulfilling is, yes.
I mean, I think the issue is, for me, is more what Cécile was saying, which is it's a closed world and there's repetition within it. And either you enjoy the repetition, which is often to do with style and technique within his work, because the motifs are the same. There's a very finite number of motifs. There's different models, but they're often actually occupying the same motif. So I think it's more that there isn't a huge amount of progression within the work, apart from the style of it and the technique.
But it's all the great painters, the great romanciers, writers, has their own world, and it's always an obsession. You know, it's if you take Matisse, this is always the same motifs also.
Yes.
You know, they were living with their mother, and the mother was always traveling, but it was exile also, because she quit her husband. They were in Berlin, and then she went to France.
When she quit the father, what age?
They were in Paris. They were 6. Yeah. And so they live in Paris, in Switzerland, in Berlin, and then they travel to Poland and so on. And so the mother was, you know, a character also. She was a little bit like an artist. She painted also. She had a love affair with Rilke, and she organized a sort of salon where all the intellectual writers and were invited, and so the children lived in a adult world, and they lived so with all these people, artists and writers, but they were always traveling, so without any roots, and in material insecurity, because they were poor, and they don't show it. They were rich at the beginning, and they became poor.
And it's interesting you say this, because one of the things that Balthus kept saying when people looked at his drawings of young women but also children, boys, and he always said that look at children. This is how children are when they're when they're in their own world and so on. And I really think from the very few photographs we have of him as a young adolescent, it really feels the world was this. It was a salon, it was always with books, it was very intellectual, but it was always alone very much with this kind of sense of...
And there was a discourse at the time around childhood, and childhood being sort of self-contained as an almost kind of naive or primitive state. You know, Jean Cocteau's Enfant Terrible was based on, in parts, Balthus and his brother, so it was part of a wider phenomenon as well.
And there is another question with Pierre Klossowski. It's the question of their... they were Jews through their mother, and Pierre Klossowski became Catholic, and Balthus has had a very complicated relationship with the religion, and so all this question of identity, exile, and they you know, he wanted to stress that his father came from the aristocracy of Poland, but it was a very small aristocracy. You know, in Poland, everybody was aristocrats. So, but he built on this, and so he became the Comte de Rolla. But he was also a Jew. So it's, yeah, interesting.
We had one more question here.
I mean, I'll just kick off. I'll start with landscape, and I completely agree with you. And it goes all the way through his career. So there's, you know, fantastic examples. You had the very small painting of the landscape, which is references Poussin. Yes. There's of course the very large one at the Met of the Mountaineers, which is extraordinary. And it goes all the way through to, you know, the middle of the career, where it goes into literal landscape painting, the view from his studio window in France. So yeah, it's very important. And you could also think about his relationship to genre is quite interesting. You know, are these portraits? He makes still lifes, he makes landscape. Often they're between those things, though. It's not you know, completely straightforward. And then to speak about Japan, I mean, obviously, in part, this is also related to Setsuko, who was his wife, his final wife.
Yeah.
And obviously was the subject in several of those paintings, including the amazing painting, The Turkish Chamber, which was painted at Villa Medici in a room that was tiled with Turkish tiles, and features Setsuko. And it's an extraordinary painting, and I completely agree with you that, and it goes back to what I was saying before, that actually you could make a case that the late paintings are more difficult and more radical, maybe as difficult and as radical as the early paintings. But do you want to pick up on?
No, just his first paintings were landscapes, because he was fascinated by Piero della Francesca, and he did travel to Italy, Arezzo, in 1926, and he already, when you see this, he already built his landscape with several layers. And so, yeah, it's landscape. It's very important for him since the beginning. And when he acquired Chassis castle, it's not really a castle, but
Chalet, but the
no, a
Chassis.
Chassis. It's more a farm, large farm, but he come again to the, let's say, landscape champêtre, but he did a marvelous Parisian landscapes at the beginning.
And Japan?
Japan. He was fascinated by Japan estampe very early, and this is why he was linked to Derain, but also with Bonnard, and he was. I think it came from his mother, so he knew very early the Japanese art, and then of course with Setsuko, because he did this travel to Japan, and with Setsuko, all these paintings in Villa Médicis are extremely interesting, because we were speaking about the late paintings, but these ones are exquisite because he played with a sort of Orientalism with Japanese, Italian, and yes. So he was always playing as he's from outside, and he plays with references, but with a fancy way.
And in those works, moving away from the more Western kind of fixed point perspective to this extraordinary tessellated all over design. A bit like Matisse, actually. It's very interesting.
Yeah. No, I'm conscious that, Nick, you also have another place to speak this evening, but we'll take one more question that we had there. Yes?
It was a childhood
It was
nickname,
very early on, yeah. Balthus, it was Balthus almost pronounced, and it was, and Rilke used to call him that as an adolescent all the time, my Balthus, and in his letters and everything. So it was something he really grew up with. Yeah.
It is his name, just francisé, but it's not a change of name.
It just seems like changing from Tiziano to Titian. It's like Romanizing.
No, I'm not sure, because it was from the beginning, very beginning, as nearly a child. We have in our archives a letter by Balthus to Picasso, and this letter is very interesting because he expressed expresses his admiration, and he say you are the man who is a sort of who's shy and also is the one who destroy, and you have the both aspect in your art, and that's what I like in your. You are a master for me because you have the both aspect. So I imagine it comes from this idea of both sides, but perhaps it's true when he told this to Picasso, he meant that he was in a certain way he had the same oppositions.
Well, I think the conclusive words are perhaps connected with what we've experienced, and I really do want to say this today, that we've experienced in the last 2 months an unprecedented number of artists and art students walking in the doors, and with huge enthusiasm to think about figurative painting today. And I know that this is also one of the reasons that Nicholas was so happy and keen to come here today and talk about this, because when we met here and had a chat about the show, the main conversation was really about how interesting it is to think about that whole trajectory of 20th century art and all those atypical artists who were fighting to make new figurative painting in a time where that was really out of fashion. But so in this kind of key, I'd really like to thank both of you for taking such a long time and sharing such incredible knowledge with us, because this has really been exceptional. And to thank everybody for coming today. And I'm really pleased despite the fact we couldn't keep all of the paintings that started this show, could extend it by a whole month, because really I think it's been doing a lot of good for a lot of people to see and to talk and to raise the discussion around Balthus. So yes, thank you very much. Thank you.